Alright, today I will be reading Blood Meridian, the rest of Chapter 2, and maybe even Chapter 3, by Cormac McCarthy. So today, I don't really feel like propping my camera, because I cannot prop my camera up right now. I don't have anything to prop it up on. So, I'm going to turn my camera around and just put it on my pillow, so it'll be pitch black. You guys can still hear me. Alrighty. Let's get this chapter going. Last time, I checked over my video, and I ended on Powder House in the distance. A light breeze stirred the fronds of his hat. His matted, greasy hair, his eyes lay dark and tunneled in a caved and haunted face, and a foul stench rose from the wells of his boot tops. The sun was just down. In the west lay reefs of blood-red clouds out of great... Wait. Oh, I just kind of dyslexia moment. Hold on. Blood-red clouds up out of which rose little desert nighthawks, like fugitives from some great fire at the earth's end. He spat a dry, white spit and clumped the cracking wood stirrups against the mule's ribs, and they staggered into motion again. He went down a narrow, sandy road, and as he went, he met a dead cart bound out with loads of corpses. A small bell tolling the way, and a small bell tolling the way, and a lantern swinging from the gate. 3 men sat on the box, not unlike the dead themselves, or spirit folk, so white they were with lime and nearly phosphorescent in the dusk. A pair of horses drew the cart, and they went up on the road in a faint miasma of carbolic and passed from sight. He turned and watched them go. The naked feet of the dead jostled stiffly from the side to side. It was dark when he entered the town, attended by barking dogs, faces parting, the curtains in the lamplight windows, the light clatter of the mule's hooves echoing in the little empty streets. The mule sniffed the air and swung down an alleyway into a square where there stood in the starlight, a well, a trough, a hitching rail. The kid eased himself down and took the bucket from the stone coping and lowered it into the well. A light splash echoed. He drew the bucket. Water dripped in the dark. He dipped the gourd and drank, and the mule nuzzled his elbow. When he'd done, he set the bucket in the street and sat on the coping of the well and watched the mule drink from the bucket. He went on through the town, leading the animal. There was no one about by and by. He entered a plaza, and he could hear guitars and a horn at the far end of the square. There were lights from a cafe, and laughter and high-pitched cries. He led the mule into a square and ended up far side past a long portico toward the lights. There was a team of dancers in the street. They wore gaudy costumes and called out in Spanish. He and the mule stood at the edge of the lights and watched old men sat along the tavern walls, and children played in the dust. They wore strange costumes, all the men in dark, flat-crowned hats, white nightshirts, trousers, and buttoned up the outside leg. The girls with garish painted faces and tortoiseshell combs in their blue-black hair. The kid crossed the street with the mule and tied it and entered the cafe. A number of men were standing at the bar, and they quit talking when he entered. He crossed the polished clay floor past a sleeping dog and opened one eye and looked at him. And he stood at the bar and placed both hands on the tiles. The barman nodded to him. What's the name of an alcohol? Gotta be. Digamy. He said. Digamy, he said. I ain't got no money, but I need a drink. I'll fetch out the slops, or mop the floors, whatever. The barman looked across the room to where two men were playing dominoes. I just kind of assumed cards. Dominoes at a table. Abuelita, he said. The older of the two raised his head. ¿Qué dice el muchacho? I'm not good at Spanish. Maybe I should know Spanish by now. ¿Qué dice el muchacho? The old man looked at the kid and turned back to his dominoes. The barman shrugged his shoulders. The kid turned to the old man. You speak American? He said. You speak American? He said. The old man looked up from his play. He regarded the kid without expression. Tell him I'll work for a drink. I ain't got no money. The old man thrust his chin and made a clucking noise with his tongue. The kid looked at the barman. The old man made a fist with the thumb pointed up and the little finger down, tilted his head back and tipped the phantom drink down his throat. Quiere echarse una copa? He said. Pero no puedo pagar. Pagar? I make myself sound like an idiot. Oof. The men at the bar watched. The barman looked at the kid. Quiere trabajo, said the old man. Quien sabe. He turned back to his pieces and made his play without further consultation. Quieres trabajar, said one of the men at the bar. They began to laugh. What are you laughing at? Said the boy. They stopped. What are you laughing at? Said the boy. They stopped. Some looked at him. Some pursed their mouths or shrugged. The boy turned to the bartender. You got something I could do for a couple drinks? I know damn good and well. One of the men at the bar said something in Spanish. The boy glared at them. They winked one of the others. They took up their glasses. He turned to the barman again. His eyes were dark and narrow. Sweep the floor, Sweep the floor, he said. The barman blinked. The kid stepped back and made sweeping motions. A pantomime that bent the drinkers in silent mirth. Sweep, he said, pointing at the floor. No está sucio, said the barman. He swept again. Sweep, goddammit, he said. The barman shrugged. He went to the end of the bar and got a broom and brought it back. The boy took it in hand, went on and back on the room. A great hall of a place. He swept the corners where potted trees stood, silent in the dark. He swept around the spittoons, and he swept around the players at the table, and he swept around the dog. He swept along in front of the bar, and when he reached the place where the drinker stood, he straightened up, leaned on the broom, and looked at them. They conferred silently among themselves, and at last one took a glass from the bar and stepped away. The others followed. The kid swept past them to the door. The dancers had gone. The music. Across the street sat a man on a bench, dimly lit in the doorlight from the cafe. The mule stood where he tied it. He tapped the broom on the steps and came back in and looked at the broom in the corner. And took the broom to the corner where the barman had gotten it. Then he came to the bar and stood. The barman ignored him. The kid rapped with his knuckles. The barman turned and put one hand on his hip and pursed his lips. How about that drink now? Said the kid. The barman stood. The kid made the drinking motions that the old man had made, and the barman flapped his towel idly at him. Andale, he said. He made a shooing motion with the back of his hand. The kid's face clouded. You son of a bitch, he said. He started down at the bar. The barman's expression did not change. He brought up from under the bar an old-fashioned military pistol with a flintlock and shot back and shoved back the cock with the heel of his hand. A great wooden clicking in the silence, the clicking of glass all down the bar. Then the scuffling of chairs pushed back at the players of the wall. The kid froze. "Old man," he said. The old man didn't answer. There was no sound in the cafe. The kid turned to find him with his eyes. "Está borracho," said the old man. The boy watched the barman's eyes. The barman waved his pistol toward the door. The old man spoke to the room in Spanish. Then he spoke to the barman. Then he put his hat down and went out. The barman's face drained when he came around at the end of the bar. He had laid down the pistol. He was carrying a bung starter in one hand. The kid backed to the center of the room, and the barman labored over the floor toward him, like a man on his way to some chore. He swung twice at the kid, and the kid stepped twice to the right. Then he stepped backwards. The barman froze. The kid boosted himself lightly over the bar and picked up the pistol. No one moved. He raked the frizzen open against the bar top and dumped the priming out and laid the pistol down again. Then he selected a pair of full bottles from the shelves behind him. He came around to the end of the bar with one each in hand. The barman stood in the center of the room. He was breathing heavily, and he turned, following the kid's movements. When the kid approached him, he raised the bung starter. The kid crouched lightly with the bottles and fainted, and then broke the right one over the man's head. Blood and liquor sprayed the... One sec, let me restart that. The kid crouched lightly with the bottles and fainted, and then broke the right one over the man's head. Blood and liquor sprayed, and the man's knees buckled and his eyes rolled. The kid had already let go of the bottleneck. And I am reading so badly today. The kid crouched lightly with the bottles and fainted, and then broke the right one over the man's head. Blood and liquor sprayed, and the man's knees buckled and his eyes rolled. The kid had already let go of the bottleneck, and he pitched the second bottle into his right hand in a Rogent's pass. Before it even reached the floor, he backhanded the second bottle across the barman's skull and crammed a jagged remnant into his eye. As he went down, the kid looked around the room. Some of those men wore pistols in their belts, but none moved. The kid vaulted the bar and took another bottle and tucked it under his arm and walked out the door. The dog was gone. The man on the bench was gone too. He united the mule and led it across the square. He woke up in the nave of a ruinous church, blinking up at the vaulted ceiling and the tall swagged walls with their faded frescoes. The floor of the church was deep in dried guano, and the droppings of cattle and sheep, pigeons flapped through the piers of dusty light, and the three buzzards hobbled about on the picked bones carcasses of some animals dead in the chancel. His head was in torment, and his tongue swollen with thirst. He sat up and looked around him. He put the bottle under his saddle. And he found it and held it and shook it and drew the cork and drank. He sat with his eyes closed. The sweat beaded on his forehead. Then he opened his eyes and drank again. The buzzard stepped down one by one and trotted off on the sacristy. After a while, he rose and went out to look for the mule. It was nowhere in sight. The mission occupied 8 or 10 acres of enclosed land, a barren purlieu. that held a few goats and burrows in the mud. Walls of the enclosure were cribs inhabited by families and squatters, and a few cook fires smoked thinly in the sun. He walked around to the side of the church and entered the sacristy. Buzzards shuffled off through the chaff and plastered like enormous yard fowl. The domed vaults overhead were clotted with dark furred masses that shifted and breathed and chittered. In the room was a wooden table with a few clay pots, and along the back wall lay the remains of several bodies, one a child. He went on through the sacristy into the church again and got his saddle. He drank the rest of the bottle. He put the bottle on his shoulder and went out. The facade of the building bore an array of saints in their niches, as they had shot up by American troops, trying their rifles. The figures shorn of ears and noses, darkly mottled with lead marks, oxidized upon the stone. The huge carved and paneled doors hung a whop on their hinges, and a carved stone virgin held her arms, a headless child. He stood blinking in the noon heat. Then he saw the mule's tracks. They were just the palest disturbance of dust, and they came on the door of the church and crossed the lot to the gate in the east wall. He hiked the saddle higher onto his shoulder and set out after them. A dog in the shade of the portal rose, lurched sullenly out into the sun, until he had passed and then lurched back. He took the road down into the hill toward the river. A ragged figure enough he entered, a deep wood of pecan and oak. The road took a rise, and he could see the river below him. Blacks were washing a carriage in a ford. He went down the hill and stood at the carriage at the edge of the water. After a while, he called out to them. They were stopping water over the black lacquerwork, and one of them raised and turned to look at him. The horse stood to their knees in the current. "What?" called the black. "Have you seen a mule?" "Mule? I lost a mule. I think he came this way." The black wiped his face in the back of his arm. "Something come down the road about an hour back. I think it went down the river yonder. Might have been a mule. It didn't have no tail or no hair to speak of, but it did have long ears." The other two blacks grinned. The kid looked off down the river. He spat and set off along the path through the willows and swales of grass. He found it about 100 yards downriver. It was wet to its belly, and it looked up at him and then lowered its head again into the lush river grass. He threw down the saddle and took up the trailing rope and tied the animal to a limb and kicked it half-heartedly. It shifted slightly to the side and continued to graze. He reached atop its head, but he had lost the crazy hat somewhere. He made his way down through the trees and stood looking at the cold, swirling waters. Then he waded into the river like some holy, wretched baptismal candidate. And that would mark the end of chapter 2. I know this was kind of overdue by who knows how long, about a few days. I'm just not a fan of reading, and I think this is kind of a better way of making me better at reading. I hope you enjoyed this video in this reading of the other half of Chapter 2 of Blood Meridian. Maybe someday, depending on how long people will have this book for from the library, I will probably read Chapter 3 or 4. Hell, I might record Chapter 3 right now after this video, honestly. I got nothing to do today. Or tonight. But I have other books in the meantime that I could read. So, hope you all have a nice night.